It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in, and I just know, just for days, you just couldn't think that he was gone, you know. So yeah, I was just.
In the 1960s, the Beatles weren't just a band, they were a cultural revolution. From Liverpool's smoky clubs to the screaming crowds of Shea Stadium, John, Paul, George, and Ringo seemed like brothers bonded by destiny. To the outside world, they were untouchable. Every song climbed the charts, every appearance drew hysteria, every word they spoke was immortalized. But behind closed doors, the magic wasn't as effortless as it appeared. Paul McCartney later revealed that as early as 1966, the band's unity began to fray. Exhaustion from relentless touring, creative disputes, and the pressure of carrying the weight of the world's adoration began to gnaw at their friendships. "We were lads from Liverpool," Paul said years later, "but the world turned us into something bigger than any of us could handle." That transformation came at a cost. Paul was known for his perfectionism. His insistence on multiple takes, on precision, on harmony, was both the band's driving force and its greatest source of tension. John Lennon, in contrast, thrived on rawness, on expression over perfection. The contrast wasn't hostile at first, it was the very chemistry that gave the Beatles their balance. But by the late 1960s, those differences hardened into rivalries. George Harrison quietly seethed at being sidelined, while Ringo, ever the peacemaker, often walked out in frustration. Paul admitted decades later that he could feel the band's foundation trembling long before the public knew. "We were trying to hold it together," he confessed, "but it was like holding sand. It kept slipping through our fingers." John. Lennon was restless, spiritually, artistically, personally. Fame had made him hollow, searching for meaning beyond the screaming fans and flashing cameras. Drugs offered temporary escape, but his soul longed for something deeper. Paul, meanwhile, carried the burden of leadership. He was the one pushing projects forward, scheduling studio sessions, keeping the music alive. "I didn't want to be the boss," Paul admitted years later, "but someone had to be." That imbalance would become a source of resentment, and it was in this fragile moment that Yoko Ono entered John's life. In 1966, John Lennon walked into a London art gallery and met Yoko Ono, an avant-garde artist whose work was as polarizing as it was profound. To John, she was unlike anyone he had ever met. Fearless, intellectual, unapologetically herself. "She was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't alone," John once said. Their connection was instantaneous, cosmic even. Soon, they were inseparable. But this new bond had consequences. Yoko was not content to remain in the background. She sat beside John during recording sessions, whispered in his ear, challenged him, inspired him, and, in the eyes of the other Beatles, disrupted the sacred chemistry of the group. For Paul, George, and Ringo, the studio had always been their sanctuary, a place where music came before everything else. Suddenly, Yoko was there, every day, every hour. Paul admitted later that it was like inviting someone into your marriage bed. It wasn't just her presence. It was the way John seemed to drift further from them, as if his heart and loyalty had been redirected. The others whispered among themselves, frustrated and confused. They didn't hate Yoko, Paul insisted years later, but they hated what was happening to John and to their band. Publicly, Paul said little. Privately, he wrestled with emotions he didn't dare voice. There was resentment, yes, but also fear. Fear of losing John, fear of losing the Beatles, fear of watching everything they had built collapse. "I didn't blame Yoko," Paul reflected decades later. "I blamed the circumstances, but at the time, it was easier to point the finger at her." This silent battle, between loyalty to his band and acceptance of John's new life, would define Paul's unspoken struggle for years. By 1970, the unthinkable had happened. The Beatles were no more. Fans around the globe cried out for an explanation, and the simplest one was repeated endlessly: Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles. It was a narrative the press devoured and the public clung to. After all, Yoko had been visible during those final, turbulent years. Her presence was undeniable. And so she became the villain, branded the woman who tore apart the greatest band in history. Paul, meanwhile, stayed mostly silent, offering only guarded words in interviews. He carried his bitterness privately, never publicly striking at Yoko, but never defending her either. The silence was, in its own way, an accusation. The truth, Paul later admitted, was far more complicated. The Beatles had been crumbling long before Yoko arrived. Money disputes, legal battles, creative differences, all of it had driven wedges between the four men. Yoko had been a factor, but not the cause. The Beatles were already on the way. Out, Paul finally confessed. If it hadn't been Yoko, it would have been something else. Those words revealed a painful truth he had held in for decades. Yoko hadn't destroyed the Beatles. Time, fame, and human frailty had. Though Paul never outwardly lashed out at Yoko, resentment simmered beneath the surface. For years he avoided contact with her, speaking only when necessary. And yet, as the decades passed, respect slowly grew. He saw the devotion between John and Yoko, saw how she carried his memory after his murder in 1980, saw how fiercely she protected his legacy. In those moments, Paul began to understand. What once seemed like intrusion now looked like love. What once felt like theft now appeared as fate. In recent years, Paul McCartney, now 82, has spoken more openly than ever before. In interviews and documentaries, he has reflected on the Beatles, on John, and on Yoko. One moment stood out. When asked directly about Yoko's role in the band's breakup, Paul paused, sighed, and finally spoke the words fans had been waiting to hear. "We all thought she broke us up," he admitted. "But the truth is, she gave John something we couldn't." Paul explained that Yoko had given John Lennon a lifeline, a sense of purpose and belonging that even the Beatles couldn't provide.
"He needed her," Paul said softly. "More than he needed us. And if I'm honest, I resented that. But I understand it now." These words, decades in the making, were more than an admission. They were an absolution. Paul McCartney, the
man who had lived in the shadow of that narrative for half a century, was finally freeing both Yoko and himself from the blame. Today, at 82, Paul's voice carries the weight of time, loss, and wisdom. His admission does not erase the pain of the Beatles' breakup, nor the bitterness of those years, but it reframes the story. Yoko was not the villain. She was John's partner, his muse, his anchor. And in acknowledging that, Paul offers fans a new way to see history, not as a tragedy of betrayal, but as a story of love, art, and human fragility. "We were kids," Paul said. "We didn't know how to handle it. But looking back, I see it now. Yoko didn't take John away. John chose Yoko, and maybe that's what he needed." As the camera fades, the message is clear. After decades of silence, resentment, and speculation, Paul McCartney has finally spoken the truth. And in doing so, he closes a chapter, not just in his own life, but in the story of the greatest band the world has ever known.